Welcome back to the course Site 101X on Technology Evaluation. I'm Dan Fry, and now I'm going to talk about instrumenting products for field evaluation. This is a new option just emerging. It wasn't around or really practical several years ago, but now I think it's mature and ready to be considered as an important possibility. The idea is that you place sensors into the products along with electronics for data preprocessing, logging, and transmission, along with perhaps a battery, and you can take measurements of certain parameters in the field for long periods of time. Just as an example, consider a study that was done by D-Lab students and staff on use of clean cook stoves. So here is a clean cook stove. And here is something called a stove use monitor. It can detect, for example, the rise in temperature when the stove is being used. And this particular stove use monitor also included the ability to detect motions we'll see. This was coupled with a household air pollution monitor, something that was mounted up on the wall of the dwelling, and gave an indication of the change in air quality due to use of the different stove. So these types of low-cost sensors really provide some interesting capabilities. And let me run through some of the different types of sensors that are commonly used and some of the things that they enable. As an example, an accelerometer, if embedded in a product, would give you an indication that had been, for example, picked up, that someone was walking with it, or just in general, it gives an indication of motion. We mentioned the idea of an air quality sensor. You could measure particulate pollution in any dwelling. A thermometer would allow you ability to assess the environment in which a product is being used. And in the case of a stove, you would indicate whether it's being used at all, which is a concern about stoves. Then there are voltmeters, which we have used to determine the state of a product, whether a product had been turned on. Now, with this suite of sensors, and there are more all the time, there comes some terrific advantages. Once you have placed the sensor into a product along with a data logger, you get a kind of a persistence of observation. Let's take a look at some data that came from that stove use monitoring study. Here we see temperature logged over time, and we see 120 hours of observation. That would be a difficult thing for a person to record, to sit and watch someone else either using or not using a stove over such a duration. And so there's the persistence. Then there's also duration. 120 hours is nowhere near the limit of what you might be able to stay on site in a product. You could keep sensors running for weeks and months. So that extended duration of a study may really provide some benefits. You can get high sampling frequency, and that is especially true if you only need the frequency to be high in bursts. And I think that the idea of moving the human observer out of the location of product use could provide some benefits. I mean, at some level, a person being there to see how the product is being used is intruding on that person's daily life. But then again, let's think through what some of the ethical considerations are. If you put a sensor into a product that someone is using in their daily life, you have to take seriously the possibility that you are intruding on their privacy. Have you put in adequate safeguards to protect the user and their reasonable expectations of privacy? Could somehow harm result from the sensors being there or from the distribution of the data in the sensors? For example, we know that it's possible that sensors could provide indication of someone's location. Could you be doing harm to someone by divulging their location? Or could knowledge of the sensors being present affect the behavior in ways that adversely affect either the user of the product or the legitimacy of the study in some way? So you have to take these ethical considerations seriously. That's always true, but there are new considerations you have to take into account with these sensors. Now, before you even decide to bring sensors into the field, there are some preparations you're going to have to take. For one thing, you have to get your team ready. Do you have the right expertise in electronics? That's important to consider. It's getting easier all the time, but think about whether you have the capability. Think about the physical variables that you'll measure. Think about the types of sensors you'll incorporate, because there are multiple sensors for any given variable, and they vary in their accuracy and in their robustness to different environments. How many sensors are you going to use of each type? Just deciding that you're going to have an accelerometer may not be enough. You may decide to put one in the front of a wheelchair and one in the back to get a clear indication of rotation, for example. You have to think carefully about battery capacity. It's easy to imagine just putting on a larger battery, but now you're starting to negatively affect the properties of the product by adding additional battery. So you try to get size the battery appropriately for the needs of the sensor and the data logger. Think about whether you're going to pre-process your data. If you can do that, if you can look for certain events and record only the most important or interesting information, you might be able to extend your duration considerably by incorporating just a little bit of software on board of your data logging system. Think about your sampling rates and whether or not you may just want to log data at certain events or for a limited time period after certain events. Think about whether you want to upload data periodically by, for example, SMS or Bluetooth. By doing that, you maybe have more flexibility in your study. And remember to think about the effects of the environment. I mean, if you put a sensor in place and then humidity degrades its function, or insects start to block the flow of air to air pollution monitor, then you may be getting inaccurate information. So the last thing that I can say about preparing for instrumentation is that you're going to want to test your system. You're going to want to test the first one and make sure that the logic of your system is right. And you're going to want to test each particular implementation of the instrumentation, because you don't want to put them out in the field and then find out a few days in that you're not getting valid data. Now, one of the great benefits of having put instrumentation into products is that in some ways it informs understanding of the whole comparative rating chart, not just the things that came from the field, but also things that came from the lab. As an example, here we see runtime on high setting for solar lanterns, and we have different scores given depending on whether something lasted 21 hours or 6 hours. But if instrumentation in solar lanterns were to indicate that the longest duration anyone used a solar lantern in the evening was 6 hours, maybe we should not make such a great distinction in the ratings chart between those two outcomes. So if we learn something like that, we'd want to take account of it, and instrumenting products is probably one of the few ways we would find out that particular piece of knowledge. So let me just conclude by saying that instrumenting products is an important new tool. It can provide persistence and much longer duration as compared to other techniques you might use in field studies. You do need to have some knowledge of electronics, either inherent in your team, or else you can bring in someone from the outside. But remember what skills it demands. It becomes more important to account for special ethical considerations that need to be accounted for, particularly the possibility that you're invading someone's privacy. But if all those gates are passed, you may be able to implement some of these sensing techniques and improve your understanding of usage patterns in ways that surveys cannot reliably do, and it may help your interpretation of ratings across the study. So, thanks very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to interacting with you online.